Welcome everybody to the Badger History Group lecture. Tonight we're going to have Curt Meine speaking, which we're really pleased to have. We want to thank you for all coming, and we want to support. Thanks to all our donors that help make this possible and make all of our work at Badger History Group possible. We're a volunteer organization, and I want to thank Heather for her work with the tech support always, and to Verlin for starting this whole lecture series 5 years ago. And now these lectures are on the second Wednesday of every month from September through May. And Dan Halling has been taking charge of the lectures and been doing a great job. Next lecture will be on December 13th, and that'll be Randy Palma, the land manager for the Ho-Chunk Nation. And the talk will be Stewardship at Meine. You can check our website activities page for future presentations. Also follow us on Facebook at Badger History Group BHG for upcoming events. Tonight's lecture, for those on Zoom, please keep yourself muted and keep your video off. Will help improve the broadband access for everyone. And we'll have Q&A at the end. So please hold your questions till then. And for those on Zoom, please just type them into the chat and we'll ask them for you. Tonight's lecture is going to be all about the days when Badger was just closing, and no one was certain what was going to happen. And it ended up being all about collaboration and working together. And we just have some pictures on here from from the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance Facebook page, and we have this also on our website, I believe now on Facebook page, about a project that we've been collaborating on recently, just to show that the collaboration is still going on. And this is a project we started just recently to start clearing some of the open-grown oaks that are left here from the days of the pre-European settlement savannas and from the early days of European settlement. And you can see in the upper left there the tree before clearing, and down in the bottom right the tree after clearing. Give that tree a chance to thrive and be here to remind us all of the past and of our future as well. So Dan, I'll have Dan, one more slide. So it's up to me. Should go. Here we go. There we go. Some better view of those same pictures. Thanks to Ron Lutz, photographer, and to the crew that it only took a little over an hour to clear up that tree. So it's on its way. Dan?
Curt Meine is a conservation biologist, environmental historian, and writer based here in Sauk County. He serves as senior fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation and Center for Humans and Nature, as research associate with the International Crane Foundation, and as adjunct associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Over the last 3 decades, he has worked with a wide array of organizations at the intersection of conservation, agriculture, water, climate change, and community resilience. Curt has authored and edited several books, including the award-winning biography Aldo Leopold, His Life and Work, which came out in 1988, and a new version came out in 2010. And the Driftless Reader. He was a co-editor of the Driftless Reader that came out in 2017. That is this book. And he served as on-screen guide in the Emmy Award-winning documentary film Green Fire, Aldo Leopold and a Land Ethic for Our Time in 2017 or 2011. And he is a founding member of the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance. Now, a little personal thing. I first heard of Curt. I came to Sauk in 1991 to begin a PhD program in the land ethics at UW-Madison in the Institute for Environmental Studies. And my academic advisor was Professor Cal DeWitt. And I think it was probably our first meeting with him when he said, 3 years ago, I advised a student who completed his dissertation on Aldo Leopold, Curt Meine. There you go. Oh, okay. And I didn't know who Curt was, so I went to the university bookstore and picked up this book, Aldo Leopold, and I read it, and I thought, I was a little intimidated. If the guy 3 years before me, one of them, wrote this as his dissertation, that's a hard act to follow. I read this, and I've read it several times since. Now, I never finished my dissertation. I started teaching history at Sauk Prairie High School, and I did that for 25 years. In the last, probably 5 years, 6 years ago, I was asked to develop a course on Wisconsin history and local history, and I contacted Curt, and he met me at the old Roxbury Tavern. How do we miss that place? And he gave me a lot of names, good ideas, and I brought my copy along. He signed it for me. So that was a good time, and I was happy that he did that. I'm probably even more happy that he said he would come and give us a talk tonight. So let's welcome Curt.
Thank you, Dan. All right. Am I standing in the right place? Good. Everyone on Zoom can hopefully hear me and see the screen. I'm going to first say that I've been living with a pretty horrible cold for the last 10 days. So I'm going to not talk as much as possible. On the other hand, I prepared a presentation. So, but I will hopefully not have coughing fits in the middle of my presentation. I'm sucking on my Ricola right now, and I took my Robitussin before we started. So thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Badger History Group for inviting me to join you. I've enjoyed listening to so many of these talks, and now it's a pleasure to join you and present one. So for some of us in this room and on the Zoom audience here, it might be feel a little awkward to think historically about the Badger reuse process. It's still, in a sense, pretty fresh, like it was just yesterday for some of us. For others who are a little bit younger, a little less gray, it may seem like ancient history already. So I guess that's how history works. Eventually, our experience becomes history, and we have to figure it out along the way. So I want to thank Mike for sharing this nice aerial image. This has become a favorite now that I've been, Mike shared it a few weeks ago, and I've been using it actually in a couple presentations because it really does capture so much about the Badger landscape and Mawakkenchunk in particular there in the middle ground there. And it captures kind of the transition of the landscape and helps us to see both the past as it endures, but also the changes of the present and maybe a bit of the trajectory of the future. And I want to thank Grace in the audience here for finding this little tidbit from one of the old newspapers. This is from the summer of 1988. Sauk County puts an ad in the paper What should be done with the Badger Army ammunition plant? The question that was consuming so many of us in this community back then. But what I want to talk about is how we went from that to this. How did we go from not knowing what would happen to the place to achieving, or as the headline here says, coming to this rare achievement of the Badger reuse plan? So that I've used that headline, and that it was the lead editorial in the State Journal back in 2002. So how did we go from not knowing to having done something quite unexpected, maybe even unexpected to many of us who were involved in the process? You're gonna hear, well, let me punch up just these couple quotes from that just to give you a sense of it. It took 5 years. The fact that it began with so many levels of government and viewpoints and emerged with agreed upon plan is nothing short of stunning. Central to the success was the Badger Reuse Committee, 21 people representing a spectrum of groups interested. And vital to the mission was the thoroughness. Every viewpoint got its say. Vital was the realization by most that their judgment ought to be enlightened by the greater good. So you can imagine how many of us, when we read this, were just felt such satisfaction with seeing recognition for the hard work that hundreds and hundreds of people had contributed. So it's a much larger story, even this short 5-year period, than I can give tonight. It's got a lot of angles. What I'm going to share with you tonight is really kind of looking through the lens of conservation. There are many different lenses we could look back on this with, but that'll be the main lens that I'm going to use tonight. And here's what I'm going to do. For those of you who are old timers, this will be a review. For those of you who are new timers, this will be a little more detailed than you might have seen before on just the basic context and timeline. A little bit of looking back at the reuse process, sampling some of the things that went on in that period. But really the heart of this talk is that third bullet there, looking at what was shaping, what was happening around us at that time that helped us to get from point A to point B. And then we'll leave some time for discussion, I hope. So let's start with that first bullet, looking in context and timeline. Badger was already, obviously, had been for decades a object of community discussion and participation. But of course, it was in the news a lot through the early 90s because of the environmental legacy of Badger, the work of the Citizens for Safe Water around Badger, the work of the Army and doing the cleanup and so forth and so on. There was a lot of community discussion, and frankly, a lot of it was pretty heated, pretty difficult. So we're well aware of that. Something we don't often remember, but this was also the period when discussion of expanding Highway 12 to 4 lanes was really ramping up, right? We're used to it now. It's like it's been there forever. Well, it wasn't. And so a big part of the discussion going on in Sauk Prairie, Sauk County, Dane County, was what was going to happen when this 4-lane highway went in? What would happen to the pressure for development in particular that would come with the highway? So we often forget that that was a really key part of what was shaping the discussion. And then this one also occurs to me, and I'll talk about it later on in the talk a lot, but a sister plant to the Badger plant, the Joliet Army ammunition plant outside Chicago, had been going through a very similar process. And in 1997, even before the decommissioning of Badger was announced, had already been converted to what's called the Medewind National Tallgrass Prairie. So I'll come back to this story a little later because it was a really important precedent for what would happen here at Badger. But knowing that the connection between these facilities brought it into that was part of the context for what we were beginning to engage with, all of us here at Badger. So I'll use a little different aerial photo to remind us that Badger didn't always look, of course, like it looks now. We all know that, but show this picture to anyone under the age of 20 or 25 even now, and they won't recognize that. That's our memory. That's our baseline of understanding. So I'm going to go back through that reuse 5-year period or so and just touch on a few of the things that went on. Before I do that, though, I'll give you the timeline. Again, a refresher for some of us, but some detail for others. The decommissioning of the process in late 1997. I don't know if we have yet found an exact date for that. I'm going to ask my history group friends if we can come up with a moment when we can pin a date on that. But it was in December of 97 that a group of us called a meeting at the International Crane Foundation, just of people in the conservation community, just to have an open conversation about what might happen with this 7,350 acres out here at Badger. The pace began to pick up, of course, after decommissioning. The second meeting of these conservation folks held up at Boo U in Baraboo, actually, resulted in the coalition coming together. We'll talk about CCCSP, the forerunner of the Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance. The former Congressman Scott Klug had convened his own task force and had a series of meetings in March and February and, through April to try to solve Badger. Ho-Chunk Nation had put in its request, actually for the entirety of Badger. I threw this one in for you all. That was when the Badger History Group was formed in April. The Sauk Prairie Restoration Council, which we don't remember much, but a number of us were involved in working with Dave Fordham, the former commander's rep here at the plant, to do restoration work at Badger. And I added in Mike Mossman, beginning his long story tracing the natural history of the landscape, but particularly focused on the birds. And that was such an important contribution to the discussion as it would evolve. 1988 and 99, this is when the CCCSP, again, Community Conservation Coalition for the Sauk Prairie, went into action, doing a lot of things. And you don't have to, I won't read all these things that were done during that couple-year period, but we were trying to fill in the gap in terms of the public discussion with all kinds of active community involvement and education opportunities. And so I'll talk about these in some detail in a little bit, but it was a year and a half of pretty, in retrospect, intensive community education work. 2000, we host our public lecture series. I'll mention that. And there's a poster on the back table that I brought from that, by the way. This is also when Dave Erickson completes his Powder to the People film and allows the story of Badger to be told to a much wider audience through video. Sauk County Board receives its grant through the new Congresswoman Tammy Baldwin at that point to institute the reuse planning process, July of 2000. The first meeting, I was amazed to see that there were 16 meetings of the Badger Reuse Committee over the next 9 months, and that doesn't count the subcommittee meetings and other things. Following March, 9 months from the first meeting to the last of the Badger Reuse Committee, Sauk County Board approved the reuse plan in May. That instituted then the government entities coming together as an interim commission to figure out how to make this thing work. 9/11 happens, and all of a sudden we're in a new era. And then to bring this timeline to an end, January, the interim commission develops a very important memorandum of understanding. Badger History Group, again, helps with contributing the photography exhibit and Michael Gock's book. And then at the end of 2002, on December 17th, 5 years almost to the day of that first meeting of the conservation folks at the Crane Foundation, Sauk County endorsed that memorandum. That's an amazing arc in 5 years. And in retrospect, again, you can realize when we all burnt out at least 6 times in the middle of all this. It was a heck of a lot of community work, but shared among so many people that none of us, when we needed to burn out, we took our time off and others picked it up. So I'll go over that timeline a little bit just to highlight. I can't go through all of them, but I thought I'd include a few photos. Some of you are going to smile and maybe even be embarrassed. But some wonderful photos. This is from the second meeting of the the conservation gang. This is when we chose our funny name, the Community Conservation Coalition for the Sauk Prairie. Pretty awkward and heavy name, but it was chosen with intention. We wanted to get the word community in there. We wanted to make sure that we broadcast the idea that this was going to be a bottom-up effort of everybody involved in the Badger process. So there's a lot of familiar faces there for us old timers sitting here on the steps of Park Hall in Sauk City. This is the headline from the Shopper Stopper back then, when Congressman Klug's task force failed to accomplish the goal. It was simply not given enough time. And especially this group appreciates to understand and appreciate the history of this landscape, which is so important to coming to consensus. You needed more than 4 or 5 weeks to do it. So here's Mike undertaking the first of his surveys, bird surveys. So important to providing information into the discussion of the use of the land in the future. To boil it down, I don't know how Mike would boil it down, but I would say it this way, that what Mike was able to show through these bird surveys was that the entire landscape had value for conservation. It wasn't just this or that spot on the map. The whole landscape was valuable, especially because of the populations of grassland birds that were thriving out here. And that changed the conversation. Here we are going into the active phase. Ginny is on with us on Zoom today. There you are, inspecting Victor Bachtin's painting, Sauk Prairie Remembered. That became a visual education tool for those of us in the conservation community. And the most important thing about it, and for me in retrospect, was we weren't making a case for any particular vision for Badger, actually. What it really did was serve to open up communication and conversation. So here we are. This is actually at the farmers market in Madison. For one summer, we brought the posters and tables down there and just engaged people, just talking about it. We had all kinds of fascinating conversations that season. The painting now hangs in the county courthouse in Baraboo and remains a key part of the legacy of this period of the reuse process. The conservation folks also work to engage researchers, biologists, geologists, restoration people to come out and begin the work of documenting the natural and cultural history of the landscape. We're just starting from scratch. In retrospect, kind of just come on out and let's see what we can learn. Unfortunately, Dave Fordham was able to provide access to us at that point to do so. A really key part of the reuse process was getting people to sit down and share information and ideas about what they would want to see happen at Badger. I could have chosen many photos, but I love this one. This is a meeting we held at the Dairy Forage Research Center, inviting farmers from the nearby area to come in and talk about how the future Badger could help serve their work as farmers. You'll recognize at the table Marcia Colby, among others. There's a lot going on in this photo. I could give a whole lecture actually on this photo, I think. But this particular meeting, and I'll tell the story on Marcia, at the end of this particular meeting, they were asked to kind of sum up their talk, and her last comment was, well, I just want to say something about these environmentalists. They are so eager to talk to you, and they're so curious about, they're just the greatest people. And this kind of bowled us over because the division between environmental people and agricultural people, it's well known, it was not a secret. But this meeting showed us that there was a lot of common ground and really there's Paul Dittman on one side there, of course, still in the community. So this really opened up. In fact, another key part of this, I'll talk about it in a minute, is the history of conservation in Sauk County. And I'll mention that, but during this meeting, that was a real important theme. 2000, we launched this free lecture series in the brand new Arts Center at the high school. I'd forgotten until looking at this. In fact, the last piece of that great lecture series that brought several hundred people out every Monday night was in fact the premiere of Dave Erickson's film. So it's amazing how much creativity was coming to the surface during this reuse process. But now we get into the heart of it. Tammy Baldwin, again, recently elected Congresswoman, managed to secure a grant to Sauk County that would be used to support a formal reuse process. And she was very realistic about it. I know it's hard to read from the back, so I'll just read a little bit of the highlight here. Creating a reuse plan will not be easy. There are still areas of contention, even among local residents, and the federal agencies are anxious to conclude this process as rapidly as possible. But I'm committed to giving the community a chance to decide the future of this land, to have its voice heard. The federal government acquired the property 50 years ago and has a responsibility to allow the community to be the guiding voice. I just so appreciate this in retrospect reading. Tammy Baldwin provided the grant, but she had no strings attached. She said, it's the Sauk County's now role to try to do this. And so that's what we did. Again, these are maybe a little hard, but I thought for history's sake, we'd record the 21 members of the Badger Reuse Committee, many of us still here, and Mike and I in the room here tonight. But others whose names you'll recognize, Betty Thiessen, and Brian Kinchy, and Rick Walgenbach, and many others from our community here, as well as from multiple levels of government. And we went to work. Here was the vision statement, the mission statement, I'm sorry, of the Reuse Committee: to develop a common vision for the reuse of the property that can be meaningfully considered and realistically implemented by the appropriate local, state, and federal agencies. That was the charge the committee gave itself. Here was the sequence over this 9-month period. Getting set up, having the committee gather information, just coming out to Badger and touring around, a series of reports, a lot of hard work this committee did in preparing information for its own internal use. The adoption of the reuse values, I'll say more about that in a minute, and criteria to evaluate specific proposals. 3 long meetings where everybody could come and say what they thought Badger should be. And then finally, their evaluation of this. There was a lot of pressure on that committee, and it was within the community, but it was even from the governor's office. This is Governor Tommy Thompson writing while the committee was still working, actually, and saying, Wisconsin's ownership and management interests will be consistent with the Reuse Committee's final recommendations and or other compatible uses. He's saying this even before we've come up with those recommendations. So the governor's office was watching us. And lo and behold, by the end of that 9-month process, the committee in fact did come to consensus. And it wasn't by accident, and has a lot to do with how that process was facilitated. But this was the headline and story in the April. Notice who wrote the story? Donna Staling, sitting in the front row right there.
This on newspaper things.
Yes, you did, Donna.
And then these things would come up every once in a while. Somebody would get their quick.
It was Donna's beat. So very quickly, I'm just going to highlight a few aspects of the Reuse Committee report, since most of you haven't probably looked at this document, if at all, in quite a long while. But here are our ground rules we set for ourselves. You know, develop a common vision, develop consensus recommendations. The process here: minimize and avoid the use of voting. We tried very hard never to vote for anything. Discussion, I like this one. Discussions will continue until there is agreement. So we talked and talked and talked.
If the fish were coming, that's one thing. Fish was coming with the fish. So you have all this fishy stuff going on.
Donna says there was a lot of fishy stuff going on in the background. Here are the 9 guiding values. I won't read them all. They are online if you would like to. But these, this was to me the secret to the consensus. Once we had unanimous agreement on what values would guide proposals for the reuse of badger, that gave us the filter that we all had faith in to consider what would happen. And you'll see them, you know, we can mention a few, I will mention a couple of them. Needing to manage the property as a whole, highest quality cleanup. Value 4, reconciliation. Future uses should contribute to reconciliation. Agriculture in value 6 there. And embedded in all of these, by the way, was a real commitment to history. And this is where the Badger History Group played such a vital role, while others of us were busy with other aspects, but providing the opportunity for people to tell their different stories was absolutely essential to coming to this consensus. We even sketched out a map on the committee of just kind of a general guideline to how we might see the future landscape play out. We had no idea who would own the land at that point or what they would do with it. But in general, we hoped that we would see this combination of recreation, restoration, agriculture, research, education going on across the landscape. In May of 2001, the Sauk County Board voted very strongly in support of the reuse plan. And we all went over to the Village Booksmith on the square in Baraboo, and we had a party. This was sort of the safety release valve. We were so tired, but we all went and we just piled into the bookstore and we just spent the night just having a party. That's how I remember it anyway. So you'll see again a lot of friendly faces there, including, of course, some of them who are no longer with us. So let's pay our respects to Dr. Evermore, to Jean Robkin, to Dave Tremble, and to Paula Bunch. And so we have lost a number of our friends over these last 20 plus years, but some of us are still here doing the work. Hallelujah. And I want to highlight Jason here, Jason Van Driesch. He was a master's student at the Nelson Institute at the UW-Madison. And the second item in this list of resources here, there were a number of different theses and dissertations that came out of Badger, even back then. Jason's, the second one here, is actually the most pertinent to understanding the reuse process. I think he was coming to meetings, he was observing and telling the story in his master's thesis. But I also mentioned the first one there, Diane Adams. She was the first to do this, the influence of environmental contamination on the reuse of closing military bases. Diane Adams finished her master's. Then she was the one facilitating the reuse process. She was the one Sauk County hired. So she understood Badger's history and its problems and challenges and opportunities. So Diane Adams, who last I heard was out in Seattle working, was really key to the success of this process. 9/11 came along and Badger closed up again. Still, of course, a military facility. And so it kind of threw us all, obviously, for a loop in general, but in particular for those of us involved in this. What would it mean for the future of Badger? Well, what did not mean the plant was going to reopen, but tightened down security, obviously, and many of us remember that happening. But process continued to unfold. In early 2002, the Memorandum of Understanding is signed. The Sauk Prairie Conservation Alliance comes into being as its own independent nonprofit. That's our I think that's our first board members there and other friends and supporters. And look at this guy in the front row sitting next to me. That's Rob Horwich. I'll come back to him in a little bit, but I want to mention him right now. The Badger History Group, filling its educational role in the community in such important ways. So hats off to all of you for back then doing this hard work of contributing to the community conversation. And I thought I'd choose a couple of the photos from the inside the fence exhibit. How valuable it is now to have these, obviously, as resources for us and for future generations. And there's Joe Metcalf's photo that I use now, because those are two of the Badger apple trees that we have grafted, and they continue to grow out there right near the Pioneer Cemetery. So we're getting to the end of this phase again, but in December 2002, Sauk County votes in support of the Memorandum of Agreement, and that kind of gives the stamp of approval now from every level of government, local, state, national, tribal, that the reuse process could go forward. I'm going to pause now, take my cups here, and now kind of pivot a little bit into what was going on behind the process. And I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So first I'm going to talk about what was happening in conservation science and practice. That for those of us as professionals in conservation, what we were experiencing back then that contributed. So I'm going to go through a series of developments that were happening starting, say, from the mid-'80s to the late 90s that were changing the way we think about conservation. And this is, I could do this all night, but I chose, I think, 7 of these to highlight what we as conservationists were absorbing and saw in Badger an opportunity to apply. First of them is the concept of community-based conservation. And for each of these, you'll see a little definition here, but I won't read them in great detail, but I'll highlight a couple points. Community-based conservation, as opposed to top-down, government-driven and mandated approaches, community-based conservation requires long-term investment in building relationships, listening to neighbors, developing trust, promoting honest conversation, getting to know the human and natural histories, and a shared community vision. Those words may well have been written by my friend Rick Knight, who's zooming in tonight from Colorado, because this is one of the key books that came out in those years, advancing these new ideas of community-based conservation. Second was the development of the field itself of conservation biology, which in my day in grad school wasn't even a field yet. It was just emerging, but the whole approach of conservation biology emphasizes bringing many different fields of study together to maintain biological diversity on the land. And so in 1994, one of the first main textbooks comes out. The field of ecological restoration, the idea that we can be active, positive agents in restoring damaged lands, degraded lands, ecosystems, and habitats. So this is a field, I'll talk about it in a little while again, but Wisconsin plays a very important role in the emergence of this new field, especially in the 1990s. Of particular interest tonight, environmental history as a field, which I would summarize by saying historians have tended to focus on obviously the human role. Environmental history comes along and says, well, there's more to history than just the role people play. It's the relationship of people to their places, to ecosystems, to the natural world, and how that dynamic relationship between people and nature shapes the world that we live in. Environmental justice as a movement, the idea that the harms done to the environment impact different people differently. It started as a movement in the 1980s, really came to fruition in the early 1990s to address environmental injustice occurring when poor and marginalized communities are harmed by hazardous waste, resource extraction, other land uses. Badger obviously has a role to play there, both in terms of the contamination, but the role that was played as it affected the farmers and others, the Ho-Chunk Nation and so forth. And lastly, I'll mention traditional ecological knowledge. This emerging field that emphasizes that Western science is not the only source of wisdom and knowledge about how nature works, and in fact, indigenous traditions all over the world have contributed knowledge, belief, and practices, have handed those down through generations through their songs, stories, and beliefs. And obviously, with the role of the Ho-Chunk Nation here, this becomes an especially important part of the mix of things going on. So I very quickly went through, this is all kind of happening in universities and in professions and agencies, but it's getting outside of academia too. So and this is really where the title for this talk comes from, thinking about the convergence of these fields. In the mid to late 90s, many of us having had the opportunity, especially at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, to absorb some of this and see in Badger an opportunity where all these things were intersecting. In many ways, it's a textbook example of things like conservation biology and other fields that I could have mentioned, like landscape ecology and so forth. So those were the trends that were going on that were shaping the conversations if you were in the conservation arena. But now I'm going to get beyond that and talk about a few legacies here in Sauk County that made Badger especially interesting as a place to play out these new ideas. First of all, there is the legacy of the Ho-Chunk Nation, its continuous presence and its cultural continuity over the millennia and up to the present, and even on the landscape at Badger. And I'm so grateful to Ori for compiling that list of Ho-Chunk workers at the Badger Army Ammunition Plant. That's such an amazing story that we haven't yet fully explored. But knowing that we are in landscapes that have been deeply affected by people for millennia, and how the Badger Army Ammunition Plant, right there, kind of in the middle of the tribal sessions from the 1820s and 30s of the Ho-Chunk Nation. The legacy of soil and water conservation in Sauk County. I mentioned that meeting at the Dairy Forage Center. A highlight of that meeting was one of our old friends. His name was Carl Hawkinson. Some of you may remember Carl. He was on the county land office, and he gave a whole lecture on the history of soil and water conservation in Sauk County, and all of us were blown away. We didn't know any of this. But Sauk County had a particularly strong legacy going back generations of farmers caring for their land. So we were able to pick up on that and highlight it. There's that picture again. Another key legacy here in Sauk County is that of Aldo Leopold and his national and even international significance, having arrived here in 1935. And his legacy for many of us has been deep and profound, and sometimes we don't even understand it fully because we are part of it. But Leopold contributed in so many ways. He was a forerunner in all those fields I mentioned earlier: conservation biology, restoration, environmental history. He was a forerunner in those fields. And here in Sauk County, his legacy was literally still alive, particularly through the work of his daughter, Nina Bradley, who you see up there in the upper left, along with George Archibald, the founder of the Crane Foundation. And that is another of the important Sauk County legacies. Many of us have had connections and have worked with the Crane Foundation over many, many years now. It's celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. What is so important about ICF in this story? This is what you see when you go to the campus just north of Baraboo and get a chance to see the cranes. But the work of the Crane Foundation actually happens all over the world, every day, in settings like this. From the very beginning, the Crane Foundation was committed to this way of doing conservation through communities. That has been its hallmark from day one. So whether it's in Africa or Asia or here in the US or beyond, working through communities has always been the approach that the Crane Foundation brought to its work. And that's also what brought us Rob Horwich, this character. Rob was the fellow, you will probably all seen pictures of using the costumes to raise cranes for release and reintroduction. It was Rob Horwich who developed that technique. And he was not trained in conservation science, basically. He was trained as a behaviorist, but it changed his life. And Rob went on after finishing his graduate work in Madison to found a group called Community Conservation. Still exists, still doing good work. He moved out to Gays Mills. But by golly, he would make that trip from Gays Mills to Baraboo for every single meeting involving badger. He was so committed to the reuse process and saw it as such a key part of his own legacy too. We lost Rob a few years ago, but he was a real key connector in a lot of this work. And I'm going to start moving toward finishing up here by looking at a few of the precedents. So I talked about what was going on in the academic world, what was going on in Sauk County, but there were a few specific things that also were setting the stage for us here at Badger. This is a place in Iowa called the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. It's a 3,600 area block of land originally. It was actually planned to become a nuclear plant facility. That never happened. They took over a lot of farms to create this place, but it never became a nuclear plant. So it became instead a restored prairie and a bison range. I recommend if you go to Des Moines, Iowa, to check out the Neil Smith Refuge. That was 1990. So we had a precedent for restoring large landscapes in the Midwest that had been planned for something else. A second precedent I'll mention is one that is very personal to me because I was working with this group. This is way down on the borderlands of Arizona, New Mexico, and Mexico. But the Malpai Borderlands group in 1993 kind of hit the national stage. Why? Because this group of ranchers decided that they were tired of fighting against the environmentalists, tired of fighting against the agencies. They were tired of fighting, period. And so this became a national model for ranchers sitting down with conservationists, sitting down with scientists, sitting down with the agency people and saying, let's work together. Let's work together as a community to conserve this precious landscape. And I've been able to work here for many years, and my friend Rick and Heather online as well have worked here for actually several decades now. But it provided an example of agriculture and conservation working together. There's Rick. He's online, but that's in one of the early science meetings on this spectacular and very biologically diverse landscape down on the border. I mentioned Medewan at the start of this talk, the former Joliet Army ammunition plant. You can go there, and within 40 miles of downtown Chicago, you can see a herd of bison. It's the largest restored prairie east of the Mississippi River. It's still got a long way to go, just like we do here. But if you go to Medewan, it'll look somewhat familiar to you. You'll see bunkers out in the middle of the fields. You'll see the restored prairie. So it bears a lot of, it was actually about twice as large as Badger. It's about what is up 20,000 acres. And there it is, just outside Chicago. Their process was very different. You can imagine having 20,000 acres of open space in the outskirts of Chicago. No effort was spared to protect that land for the people of the Chicago area. I really do recommend going back. It makes an interesting contrast to Badger. This is a very complicated map they have online, but you can see most of the area in gray is in some state of conservation or the other. That core area is actually the area where the bison now range. They have their own native prairie seed nursery and their own visitor center and educational activities. I included the photo in the bottom left there in particular. As far as I know, that's the only memorial of its kind to the workers of an Army ammunition plant. It was called the Joliet Arsenal at that point, but that fella in the wheelchair is one of the veterans who had worked at the Joliet plant. I really recommend a trip down there. It makes a fascinating contrast to what we have here. Just a couple more. Medewan was part of a larger network of groups all across the Chicago area, actually more than 250. businesses, organizations, nonprofits, museums, the zoos, all these organizations came together in the 1990s to focus on something we don't think of when we think of Chicago normally, right? The natural history and natural spaces of the Chicago area. And the last one I'll mention, because it was in 1996, just prior to the decommissioning of Badger. And that was the creation of the Kickapoo Valley Reserve, just to the west of us, less than an hour away. Many of you know the story of the Kickapoo Reserve. It's probably the most important precedent for us here at Badger. And this quick story is that in the late 1960s, the federal government planned to build a flood control dam on the Kickapoo River at Lafarge. It acquired 149 farms, about 8,500 acres. The dam was never built due to a range of economic and environmental concerns. But it became what is now the Kickapoo Reserve. That is the only part of the dam that was ever built. It still stands there. Most interesting for our purposes here was it was co-owned and co-managed by the state of Wisconsin and the Ho-Chunk Nation. So it provided us with a precedent for how to work with the Ho-Chunk as an entity, when many of us were still just learning. We were on a steep learning curve of what does it even mean to work with an independent sovereign nation. Well, it was the Kickapoo who gave us so many hints for how to do that. And one person in particular, Alan Anderson from Baraboo, still alive and well in Baraboo. Alan was the facilitator of this process. And if he sees this ever sometime, he'll appreciate this little story that after he finished this up in the Kickapoo and Badger was starting to warm up, I said, "Hey, Alan, you did such a great job over there at the Kickapoo. Why don't you come and help us at Badger?" He says, "No way. No way. I'm done." He was burned out. But his work and the work of the Ho-Chunk there at Badger, at Kickapoo, was so important to us here at Badger. And so they were able to show the way for us with Bill Quackenbush there speaking, who many of you know, but there with the dedication in 2001 of the Kickapoo Reserve. So to conclude up here, the Badger reuse plan and process didn't just, again, happen by accident. It was a rare achievement, but it was one that took a lot of work. But we weren't working in a vacuum. We had these trends that were driving conservation in new directions. We had these vital legacies that we're so fortunate to have here in Sauk County and South Central Wisconsin. We had these precedents from other parts of the Midwest that we could look at and learn from. And finally, we were able to develop a process that allowed this community to define and channel those shared values that were at the heart and soul of the Badger reuse plan. I think that's it. Yeah. Good, because my voice is fading fast. Thank you so much, and time for questions and comments. Bill.
Now, the administration of the DNR says this is an old plan. It doesn't have to be even looked at. And why is that? Why are they so in the blind of this reuse plan? The Conservation Alliance has a lawsuit that's still pending to try to force them to recognize this reuse plan.
Bill's question has to do with the role of the DNR and its perspective on the value of the Badger reuse plan. I don't think I want to touch that one tonight, except to say that we all know, those of us who've been part of this process, and all of us who've traveled this trail together, we know what we did, and we know the value of what we did for this community and for all of us. Politics, we can't control. All we can control is our work within the community and the way we approach it. So it's up to us to continue to educate folks about how this process unfolded and why it was so special. My shorthand way for saying it is, you know, in one of these old documents that I was going through my boxes and found, one of the DNR officials said something like, "Do you know how rare it is for us to get this much land for nothing?" And the person who was saying it didn't have quite as much understanding of the fact that it didn't come for nothing. People paid in their time and sweat and tears for what the state of Wisconsin was able to acquire. So let us continue to do the work of education and press on. Are there any questions online?
That was actually, we had a similar question of Bill's, but Rick Knight has just written and says, wonderful achievement. Congratulations to everyone involved. Thank you for caring for people and the places that nourish them. Excellent presentation.
Well, that's friends. He's an old friend of mine, so don't take everything Rick says totally seriously. No, Rick and Heather out in Fort Collins, Colorado, have been exemplars in their own landscape of this kind of work. There was actually another precedent for all this, and that was the arsenal outside of Denver. You know, that was another place, another landscape that was abandoned, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, and it became and is an important conservation area out there. So it's another example. But Rick and Heather have been holding this flag up, and we all learn from each other, and that's the other key and I think wonderful thing about Badger. We were all learning from other places, but they were learning from what we were doing here too, because what we did was very different, unique in some ways. And so we were able to share our lessons with other communities also. Mike?
Well, I just want to give an anecdote about what happens with all that outreach, because it sounds all simple and stuff, but we would go around and we'd set up our displays, and that was one time at this cow chip festival. We had our display there about it, of what we were proposing, and I just happened to be there by the display, and this elderly couple came in. They're looking around very closely at everything, you know. And I finally went up and asked the woman. I said, "Well, what do you think of this?" And she says, "Well, it's hard to be for it, and it's hard to be against it." I said, "Well, why is that?" She said, "Do you know who I am?" I said, "No, I don't." She said, "Well, I'm Frank Wolf's mother." And Frank Wolf was the big proponent, the big guy, the big person pushing for the.
He's right in front of you.
Hi, Frank. for you know, reindustrialization of the Badger ammunition plant. And I thought, well, that was really an interesting conversation, you know, and I had to give her a lot of credit for, you know, being open-minded to something that was, you know, contrary to what her son was trying to achieve.
Frank, you want a minute for rebuttal on that one?
Did you hear that story before?
No, well, never heard of it. Well, I think almost every one of us in the room who were involved, we can tell a story about changing minds and evolving ideas. I see Mike nodding his head, Lisa. All of us went through moments when someone who we thought was opposed to us, after just having the conversation, we realized, no, they're not opposed. They're just coming from a different angle. I have to figure out where they're coming from. And that was so much of the work that was quietly going on every single day for those 5 years, was sitting down, whether it was with the Ho-Chunk Nation, with the Dairy Forage Center, with, you know, the key players, but also with neighbors. I'll give one other example of that. When I first moved to Sauk Prairie, my landlady, her name is Jackie Newmeyer. Jackie's in the Waffenschmidt family, and she was 7 years old, I think, when her family was removed. And I was amazed by this when I first moved, and I can't tell you how many cups of coffee I had with my landlady living below me in that house that taught me so much about the history of Badger. And I had no clue of any of this. And she changed my mind a lot. You know, she helped me understand the stories. So those kind of stories of enriching our understanding and our human relationships, to me, that, and I think many of us will testify, that's the most important thing any of us have gotten out of this. We all started in one point. We ended up someplace we never ever thought we would be. And that's also maybe a sign of success, that you're doing it the right way when you're growing through the process, even as you're working toward a particular goal, but then you find it evolving too. It is quiet.
Is there any more questions? Heather? Okay, we'll wrap things up. Thanks so much, Curt. I know I'm gonna be thinking about a lot of this for quite a while. So I never intended things to fit like they have in this lecture series, but next month on December 13, Randy Polma will give his perspective on stewardship of the Ho-Chunk piece of this property. And so we'll look forward to that. That's December 13 at 7 o'clock. Again, come to the museum or hit the Zoom link. And thanks to everybody who showed up tonight or came via Zoom. So thanks again, Curt.
Thanks, Dan.